Admiral Kethver stood in the empty command center of his flagship. The lights were dim now. Most of his crew was dead. The great Zephyrian Empire that had ruled 17 star systems was broken. All because of the humans. He activated the recording device with one of his 4 arms. His voice was tired as he began to speak. This is Admiral Kethver of the Imperial Fleet. I am making this final report for the High Command. If anyone finds this record, know that we were defeated by an enemy we thought was weak. We were wrong. The Admiral looked out at the debris floating in space, pieces of Zephyrian ships mixed with human vessels. But there were far more Zephyrian pieces. I must tell you how this happened, how we lost everything to a species that barely knew how to travel between stars. 3 years ago, the Empire had discovered the humans. They lived in one small star system near the edge of the galaxy. The Zephyrian scouts had laughed when they saw the human ships. They were slow and weak. Their weapons were simple. Their technology was hundreds of years behind Zephyrian science. The Empire had sent exploration ships to study the humans. What they found was a species that had only recently learned to build faster-than-light engines. The humans had 3 small colonies and 1 home world. Their entire fleet was fewer than 50 ships. Most of these were not even warships. They were mining vessels and transport ships. The High Command had been pleased. Here was another species to add to the Empire. The humans would make good workers once they were conquered. Their planet looked rich with resources. It would be an easy victory. Admiral Kethvar had been given command of the operation. He was young for an admiral, but he had never lost a battle. The High Command trusted him to handle this simple task. Bring them into the Empire, they had told him. Use force if needed. The first meeting had taken place at Kepler Station. This was a neutral trading post used by many species. The humans had asked for the meeting. They said they wanted to talk about peace. Captain Jake Morrison had led the human delegation. He was a tall man with gray hair and calm blue eyes. With him were Commander Lisa Grant, a woman with short red hair who seemed very smart. Chief Engineer Pete Johnson was older and had rough hands from working with machines. Diplomatic Advisor Karen White was young and spoke many languages. Kethva had brought only a small group to the meeting. He did not think the humans were important. Enough for a large delegation. The meeting room was simple. There was a round table with chairs for both sides. Captain Morrison had stood when the Zephyrians entered. "Thank you for meeting with us," he had said. His voice was respectful, but not afraid. "We hope we can find a way to live in peace." Kethvar had looked at the human leader. Morrison was smaller than a Zephyrian warrior. He had no natural weapons, like claws or fangs. His skin looked soft and weak, but his eyes were steady and intelligent. "Your species is new to space travel," Kethvar had said. "The Zephyrian Empire has ruled the stars for 1,000 years. We have conquered many worlds. We offer you a choice. Join the Empire willingly, and your people will be treated well. Resist, and we will take your worlds by force." Commander Grant had leaned forward. "What does joining the Empire mean exactly?" "Your worlds will become part of our territory," Kethvar had explained. "Your people will work for the Empire. Your ships will serve our fleet. Your resources will belong to us. In return, you will have the protection of Imperial forces." Chief Engineer Johnson had made a sound like a laugh, but not a happy one. "So we become your slaves." "You become citizens of the Empire," Kethvar had corrected. "Many species have found this arrangement beneficial." Captain Morrison had been quiet for a long time. He looked at each member of his team. Then he had spoken. "We appreciate your offer, Admiral. But humans have fought too hard for our freedom to give it up now. We cannot accept your terms." Karen White had tried to offer alternatives. Perhaps we could sign a trade agreement. We have scientific knowledge that might interest your people. Our cultures could learn from each other. Kethver had found this amusing. What could these primitive humans possibly teach the Empire? Their technology was laughable. Their ships were held together with simple metal plates. Their weapons could barely damage a Zephyrian scout ship. Your knowledge is not advanced enough to interest us, he had said. You have nothing we need. Commander Grant had stood up. Her face was red with anger. Then why do you want our worlds? Because conquest is the way of the Empire, Kethver had answered honestly. Strong species rule weak ones. This is the natural order. The meeting had continued for hours. The humans had offered many compromises. They would share technology. They would trade resources. They would even allow Imperial ships to pass through their space. But they would not surrender their independence. Captain Morrison had made the final statement for humanity. Admiral, our species has learned something important in our short time among the stars. Freedom is not given. It must be earned and protected. We cannot accept rule by any other species, no matter how powerful. Kethver had felt almost sorry for the humans. They were brave, but bravery alone could not stop the Imperial fleet. And you have chosen war, he had said. When we meet again, it will be in battle. We understand, Morrison had replied. We will be ready. As the humans had left the station, Kethver had contacted the High Command. The humans have refused to surrender. We will proceed with military conquest. The High Command had been pleased. A quick war would demonstrate Imperial power to other species. It would also provide the fleet with good training. Kethver had gathered his forces. 4,000 ships answered his call. There were heavy battleships with plasma cannons that could destroy cities. Fast cruisers with quantum shields that could deflect any weapon. Fighters that moved faster than human eyes could follow. The human fleet had been spotted near their home system. 47 ships in total. Most were converted. Civilian vessels. A few were actual warships, but they were small and poorly armed. The Empire's smallest scout ship was more powerful than the humans' largest battleship. The Admiral had studied the tactical reports. The math was simple. 4,000 Imperial ships against 47 human vessels. Each Imperial ship was worth 10 human ships. The battle would be over in hours. But as Kethver prepared for the attack, he had noticed something in the human communications his intelligence officers had intercepted. The humans were not panicking. They were not trying to surrender. Instead, they were preparing for war with calm determination. Captain Morrison had sent a message to all human colonies. We face an enemy that is stronger than us. They have better weapons and more ships. But we have something they do not understand. We have the will to fight for our freedom. We will not make this easy for them. The message had puzzled Kethver. How could a species facing impossible odds remain so confident? It was either courage or stupidity. He had assumed it was stupidity. The Imperial fleet had moved toward the human system. Kethver had expected the humans to retreat to their home world. Instead, they had advanced to meet the Imperial fleet in open space. It was a tactical mistake. It would cost them everything. Or so Kethver had thought. Now, as he sat in his damaged command center, he knew how wrong he had been. The humans had taught the Empire a lesson about underestimating an enemy. It was a lesson written in the wreckage of 4,000 ships. The first battle happened near the asteroid belt in the human system. Admiral Kethver had expected it to be over quickly. The Imperial fleet would destroy the human ships and move on to conquer their planets. It should have been simple. Commander Tony Harris led the human advance force. His ship was called the EDF Resilience. It was not impressive to look at. The hull was made from ordinary steel plates welded together. The weapons were basic projectile guns and simple missiles. But Harris had something the Zephyrians did not expect. Captain Amy Foster commanded the EDF Defiance. Her ship was even smaller than Harris's vessel. It had been a cargo hauler before the war. The humans had added armor and weapons, but it still looked like what it was, a civilian ship pretending to be a warship. Colonel Rick Stone had the strangest command of all. His ship was called the New Hope, and it used to be a mining vessel. It was slow and ugly, with large drilling equipment still attached to its sides. The Zephyrian scouts had laughed when they saw it in their reports. Kethver had deployed his fleet in the traditional Imperial formation. The heavy battleships formed the line in the center. Fast cruisers protected the flanks. Fighters spread out to catch any human ships that tried to escape. It was a formation that had won 100 battles across the galaxy. The human ships spread out in what looked like random positions. They did not form proper battle lines. They did not protect each other's flanks. From a military perspective, their formation made no sense. It violated every rule of space combat. Begin the attack, Kethver had ordered. Target their largest ships first. The Imperial fleet opened fire. Plasma beams crossed space like deadly lightning. Quantum torpedoes streaked toward the human vessels. The firepower was enough to destroy a small moon, but the humans were not where the weapons expected them to be. Somehow, they had moved between the asteroids. The plasma beams hit rocks instead of ships. The torpedoes exploded against floating debris. Commander Harris had been ready for this. The humans had spent months preparing the asteroid field. They had placed explosive charges throughout the belt. When the Imperial weapons missed their targets, Harris triggered the charges. The explosions turned space rocks into weapons. Chunks of metal and stone flew in all directions. Some pieces were as big as houses. They moved faster than bullets. The Imperial ships, designed for open space combat, were not ready for this kind of attack. Captain Foster had prepared a different surprise. Her ship released clouds of tiny metal strips. The Zephyrians had never seen anything like it. The metal strips confused their targeting computers. Their advanced sensors could not tell the difference between the strips and real ships. Lieutenant Colonel Stone had turned his mining equipment into weapons. The large drills that once dug through asteroids now fired streams of superheated gas. It was not as powerful as Imperial plasma guns, but it was effective at close range. The battle was not going as Kethver had planned. The humans were using the asteroid field like a maze. They appeared from behind rocks, fired their weapons, and disappeared again. The Imperial ships were too big to follow them into the narrow spaces between asteroids. Why are they not fighting properly? Asked Sub-Commander Vextel, Kethver's second in command. They are using irregular tactics, Kethver replied. He had studied human military history. These creatures had a long tradition of warfare, but they did not follow the same rules as civilized species. Captain Harris had more tricks. His ship deployed what looked like simple communication satellites. The Zephyrians ignored them at first. They were too small to be threats, but these satellites were not for communication. They were jammers that disrupted Imperial coordination. Signals. Suddenly, the Zephyrian fleet was having trouble communicating. Orders from the flagship took longer to reach other ships. The careful coordination that made Imperial tactics so effective began to break down. Commander Foster took advantage of the confusion. Her ship had been modified with stealth technology. It was primitive compared to Imperial stealth systems, but it worked well enough. She positioned her vessel behind a large asteroid and waited. When an Imperial cruiser came close, Foster attacked from ambush. Her weapons were not powerful enough to destroy the enemy ship, but they damaged its engines. The cruiser began to drift helplessly through the asteroid field. Lieutenant Colonel Stone had found another use for his mining ship. The cargo holds that once carried excavated ore now held thousands of small explosive devices. Stone's ship flew close to Imperial formations and released these devices like deadly seeds. The explosives were too small for Imperial sensors to detect individually. But when they detonated together, they created waves of destruction that damaged multiple ships at once. It was a tactic no civilized military would consider. The battle continued for hours. The Imperial fleet was winning, but not easily. Every human ship they destroyed cost them 2 or 3 Imperial vessels. The humans were making the Empire pay a heavy price for victory. Admiral Kethver watched the tactical display with growing concern. The humans had lost 15 ships so far. The Empire had lost 60. The math was wrong. This should not be happening. "Sir," reported his weapons officer, "the humans are using our own debris against us." It was true. The humans had somehow managed to collect pieces of destroyed Imperial ships. They were using Zephyrian technology as improvised weapons. A human fighter had just fired an Imperial plasma gun that it had somehow attached to its hull. Captain Harris had been studying Imperial tactics throughout the battle. He noticed that Zephyrian ships always responded the same way to certain situations. They followed their training perfectly, but that made them predictable. Harris began to use this knowledge. He would position his ship to trigger a specific Imperial response. Then he would exploit the predictable movement pattern. It was like playing a game where he knew his opponent's next move. Commander, Foster had discovered something else about Imperial ships. Their advanced shields were designed to stop energy weapons and high-speed projectiles. But they were not effective against slow-moving objects. Foster began using her ship's cargo manipulator arms to throw asteroids at Imperial vessels. The sight of rocks bouncing off advanced quantum shields while causing significant damage was almost funny. But Admiral Kethver was not laughing. His technologically superior fleet was being embarrassed by primitive tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Stone had made the most shocking discovery of all. Imperial ships were built to very high standards. Every system was perfectly designed and carefully maintained. But this meant they were not good at handling unexpected damage. When Stone's improvised weapons damaged an Imperial ship in ways the designers had not anticipated, the ship's computer systems became confused. Automatic repair systems tried to fix damage that did not match their programming. This sometimes made the damage worse. The humans, on the other hand, were used to equipment that broke down. Their ships were held together with spare parts and creative repairs. When something went wrong, human engineers found ways to work around the problem. After 2 days of fighting, the Imperial fleet finally won the battle. But it was not the victory Kethver had expected. The humans had been completely outnumbered and outgunned. They should have been destroyed in the first hour. Instead, they had fought for 2 days and inflicted serious damage on the Imperial fleet. They had used tactics that no civilized military would consider. They had turned their weaknesses into strengths and their environment into a weapon. As the surviving human ships retreated deeper into their system, they sent a message to the Imperial fleet. It was from Captain Harris. His ship was heavily damaged, but he was still alive. "Admiral Kethver," the message said, "you won this battle, but it cost you more than you expected. We wanted you to know that this was just the beginning. We have more surprises waiting for you." Kethver stared at the message for a long time. The humans had lost the battle, but they sounded confident about the war. They had learned something from this fight, and so had he. The Empire had always conquered through superior technology and overwhelming force. But the humans did not fight like other species. They adapted quickly. They used unconventional tactics. They refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. For the first time in his career, Admiral Kethvar began to wonder if this war would be as easy as the High Command expected. The war had been going on for 6 months now. Admiral Kethver stood in his command center, looking at reports that made no sense. The Empire was winning every battle, but somehow losing the war. The humans had surprised him again and again. Every time the Imperial fleet thought they understood human tactics, the humans changed their approach. It was like fighting an enemy that learned from every mistake. Captain Ben Clark had been the human commander on Mars. The Red Planet was humanity's largest colony after Earth. It had millions of people and important factories. The Imperial fleet had expected to capture it easily. Clark had only 12 ships to defend the entire planet. The Empire had sent 200 vessels to take Mars. The battle should have lasted a few hours at most. Instead, it had become a nightmare that lasted 3 weeks. The humans had done something that no civilized species would consider. They had weaponized the planet's weather control systems. Mars had atmospheric processors that created artificial storms to help terraform the planet. Clark had turned these machines into weapons. When the Imperial fleet entered Mars orbit, the planet's surface was covered with massive dust storms. The storms were so large they could be seen from space. They made it impossible for Imperial sensors to locate ground targets. The Zephyrian Marines had landed anyway. They were equipped with advanced armor and powerful weapons. A few dust storms should not have stopped them. But Clark had prepared more surprises. The human colonists had been evacuated to underground shelters, but they had left behind thousands of simple robots. These machines were designed for construction work. Clark had reprogrammed them to fight. Construction robots were not dangerous individually. They had no weapons except their building tools. But there were thousands of them, and they knew every tunnel and building on Mars. They attacked in coordinated swarms. Imperial Marines found themselves fighting an enemy that could not be reasoned with or intimidated. The robots felt no fear and needed no rest. When one was destroyed, 10 more took its place. The sophisticated Imperial weapons were designed to fight soldiers, not machines. Major Sue Parker had been even more creative. She commanded the human forces defending the outer colonies. These were small settlements with almost no military value. The Empire had expected to capture them without a fight. Parker had turned the colonies into traps. She evacuated the civilians, but left behind what looked like normal settlements. When Imperial forces landed to claim these worlds, they found that every building was rigged with explosives. But Parker's real genius was in her use of civilian spacecraft. The colonies had hundreds of transport ships and cargo haulers. These vessels were not warships, but Parker had modified them in unexpected ways. Some transports had been fitted with stealth systems that made them nearly invisible to Imperial sensors. Others carried powerful jammers that could disrupt communications across entire star systems. A few had been turned into suicide bombs that could destroy much larger Imperial ships. Parker's forces never fought fair battles. They attacked Imperial supply convoys and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. They sabotaged equipment and spread false information. They made the Empire pay for every mile of space they conquered. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Webb had pulled off the most audacious operation of the war so far. He had somehow captured an Imperial transport ship during a battle near Jupiter. Instead of destroying it, he had repaired it and learned to operate its systems. Webb had used the captured ship to infiltrate an Imperial supply depot. The Zephyrians never suspected that their own transport was actually controlled by humans. Webb's team had stolen advanced weapons, destroyed the depot's fuel supplies, and escaped before anyone realized what had happened. The speed with which humans learned to use alien technology amazed Admiral Keffer. His own engineers needed months of training to operate new equipment. The humans seemed to figure out Imperial technology in days or weeks. Webb had shared the captured equipment with other human forces. Soon, human ships were using modified Imperial weapons. They could not build the advanced technology themselves. but they were very good at adapting it to their needs. Captain Nina Brooks had shown the most disturbing human characteristic of all. She commanded a small squadron of human fighters near Earth's moon. Her ships were fast, but lightly armed. They should not have been able to threaten Imperial capital ships. During a battle with an Imperial cruiser group, Brooks had done something that shocked even her own allies. Her ship had been damaged and was about to be destroyed. Instead of surrendering or trying to escape, she had deliberately crashed her vessel into the Imperial flagship. The collision had destroyed both ships. But Brooks had taken out the entire enemy fleet's command center. Without coordination, the other Imperial ships had been easily defeated by the remaining human forces. This willingness to sacrifice everything for victory was something the Zephyrians did not understand. Imperial doctrine emphasized preserving valuable ships and trained personnel. The humans seemed willing to throw away anything if it helped them win. What made it worse was that other human commanders had begun copying Brooks's tactics. Suicide attacks became common in human operations. Imperial ships never knew when a seemingly defeated human vessel might suddenly turn into a guided missile. The war was changing the humans in ways that troubled Admiral Kethfer. At the beginning of the conflict, they had fought defensively. They had protected their worlds and tried to minimize casualties. Now they were becoming aggressive and ruthless. Human raids struck deep into Imperial territory. They targeted supply lines, communication centers, and isolated outposts. The attacks were small but frequent. They forced the Empire to spread its forces thin to protect everything. The humans had also begun using psychological warfare. They broadcast messages on Imperial communication frequencies. The messages were not threats or demands. They were simply humans talking about their homes and families and why they were fighting. These messages had an unexpected effect on Imperial troops. Many Zephyrian soldiers began to question the war. They had joined the military to serve the Empire, not to destroy families defending their homes. Some units reported discipline problems and low morale. Admiral Kethvar had requested reinforcements from the High Command. The response had been disappointing. The Empire was fighting wars on multiple fronts, and resources were limited. He would have to win with the forces he already had. The problem was that those forces were being worn down. The Imperial fleet had started the war with 4,000 ships. After 6 months of fighting, fewer than 3,000 were still operational. The humans had started with 47 ships and now had about 20. The math still favored the Empire, but the trend was worrying. At this rate, the war could continue for years. The High Command expected quick victories that demonstrated Imperial power. A long, costly war against primitives made the Empire look weak. The humans had also begun receiving support from unexpected sources. Some of the Empire's client species were secretly providing supplies and information to human forces. They saw the human resistance as proof that the Empire could be defeated. Captain Morrison, the human leader who had refused surrender at the first meeting, had become a symbol of resistance throughout the galaxy. His speeches were broadcast on hidden networks. Other oppressed species began to organize their own rebellions. The Empire suddenly found itself fighting multiple wars instead of just one. Resources that should have been used to crush the humans were diverted to put down uprisings on other worlds. The human war was becoming a catalyst for galactic revolution. Admiral Kethvar realized that the Empire had made a serious mistake. They had assumed that defeating the humans would be a simple demonstration of power. Instead, the war had revealed Imperial weaknesses and inspired the Empire's enemies. The humans had done something that no other species had managed in 1,000 years. They had made the Zephyrian Empire look vulnerable. They had proven that superior technology and numbers were not always enough to guarantee victory. As Kethvar prepared for the next phase of the war, He knew that everything had changed. The humans were no longer the primitive species he had first encountered. They had become something new and dangerous. The war was far from over, but the Admiral was beginning to understand that victory might come at a price the Empire could not afford to pay. The humans had forced him to fight the kind of war that empires do not survive. 1 year after the war began, Admiral Kethvar made the decision that would determine the fate of both species. He gathered every remaining Imperial ship for a final assault on Earth itself. This would end the war one way or another. The Imperial fleet had been reduced to just over 3,000 vessels. It was still a massive armada by any standard, but it represented enormous losses for the Empire. The High Command was growing impatient with the slow progress of the war. The humans had fought better than anyone expected. Their 12 remaining ships were scattered throughout the solar system, conducting hit-and-run attacks on Imperial forces. But they could not defend everywhere at once. Earth would fall, and with it, human resistance would finally be broken. Captain Morrison still commanded the human forces. His flagship was barely holding together after months of constant battle. But his voice was still clear and determined when he broadcast to all human forces, "This is our final stand. Everything we are, everything we believe in, comes down to this moment." Commander Helen Davis had brought her ship, the EDF Venture, back from a deep space mission. Her vessel had been raiding Imperial supply lines near the edge of the system. The ship was loaded with captured Imperial technology and experimental weapons. Captain Paul Wright commanded the EDF Endurance, one of the few original warships left in the human fleet. His crew had become experts at repairing battle damage with whatever materials they could find. The ship looked like a patchwork of different metals and components. Major Chris Lee had the most unusual command in the human fleet. His ship, the Second Chance, had started the war as a luxury passenger liner. It had been converted into a warship, but it still retained some of its original elegant design. Lee's crew called it the most civilized way to go to war. The Imperial fleet approached Earth in a formation that covered thousands of miles of space. Admiral Kethvar had learned to respect human tactical abilities. He would not give them any opportunities to use clever tricks or surprise attacks. The human ships met the Imperial Armada between Earth and Mars, 12 vessels against more than 3,000. The odds were so overwhelming that even the humans seemed to realize the hopelessness of their situation. Captain Morrison's final message to Earth was broadcast on all frequencies. Earth stands. Earth fights. Earth remembers. We may not survive this battle, but our sacrifice will not be forgotten. Humanity will continue, and someday we will be free. The battle began with the Imperial fleet unleashing everything they had. Thousands of plasma beams lit up space like artificial stars. Quantum torpedoes streaked toward the human ships in deadly swarms. The firepower was enough to sterilize a planet, but something was wrong. The human ships were not being destroyed as quickly as they should have been. They had new defensive systems that Admiral Kethvar had never seen before. Energy shields that could deflect plasma bolts. Armor that could withstand direct hits from quantum cannons. Commander Davis had been busy during her deep space mission. She had not just been raiding supply convoys. Her engineers had been studying captured Imperial technology and finding ways to adapt it to human ships. The defensive improvements were the result of months of secret research. The human ships fought like they had never fought before. They moved in perfect coordination, supporting each other against impossible odds. Every shot they fired found its target. Every maneuver put them in the best possible position. Captain Wright had discovered something important about Imperial fleet tactics. The Zephyrians relied heavily on their coordination systems to maintain formation and target enemies. If those systems could be disrupted, The fleet would become much less effective. Wright's ship had been modified with the most powerful jammers the humans could build. When he activated them, Imperial communication began to break down. Ships lost contact with their commanders. Targeting systems became confused. The perfect Imperial formation began to fall apart. Major Lee had prepared the most desperate tactic of all. His ship had been loaded with every explosive device the humans could gather. Nuclear warheads, antimatter charges, and experimental weapons filled the cargo holds. The second chance had become a flying bomb, but the humans were still vastly outnumbered. No matter how well they fought, they could not win against 3,000 enemy ships. Admiral Kethver could see that the battle would be over within hours. The humans would finally be defeated. That was when the real surprise came. Captain Morrison had been planning this moment for the entire war. While the Imperial fleet was focused on the human ships, they had not noticed what was happening to Earth's moon. The large satellite had been gradually changing its orbit over the past several months. The humans had built massive gravity manipulation devices on the moon's surface. These machines were hidden inside what looked like mining operations. The Empire's scouts had seen them, but dismissed them as harmless. Industrial equipment, the gravity manipulators, had been slowly accelerating the moon toward Earth, not to crash into the planet, but to use the gravitational interaction to slingshot the moon toward the Imperial fleet at incredible speed. When Morrison gave the signal, the moon became a weapon unlike anything in galactic history. It was not just moving fast, it was moving at a significant fraction of light speed. The gravitational effects alone began tearing Imperial ships apart before the moon even reached them. Admiral Kethver watched in horror as his fleet was destroyed by a celestial body turned into a kinetic weapon. Ships that had survived the firepower of human fleets were crushed by gravitational forces. The most advanced technology in the galaxy was helpless against the raw physics of a weaponized moon. The moon's passage through the Imperial formation lasted only minutes, but it was enough. More than 2,000 Imperial ships were destroyed or disabled. The survivors were scattered and disorganized. The greatest fleet in Zephyrian history had been broken by human ingenuity, but the humans had paid a terrible price for their victory. The gravitational disruption had affected their own ships as well. Most of the human fleet was destroyed in the chaos. Only 3 ships survived the battle, including Morrison's flagship. Commander Gavis had managed to use her ship's experimental shields to survive the gravitational storm. Her vessel was badly damaged, but it was still functional. Captain Wright's ship had been torn apart, but he and most of his crew had survived in escape pods. Major Lee had completed his suicide mission, but not in the way he had planned. His explosive-filled ship had been caught in the moon's gravitational field and flung into the largest remaining Imperial battleship. The collision had destroyed both vessels, but Lee's sacrifice had eliminated the Empire's most powerful remaining ship. The moon itself had been destroyed by the forces it had generated. Billions of tons of rock and metal now formed a debris field that would orbit Earth for centuries. It was a monument to human determination and the ultimate price of freedom. Admiral Kethvar's flagship was one of the few Imperial ships to survive intact. He found himself commanding fewer than 800 vessels, scattered across the solar system. His mighty fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, but the battle was not over yet. The surviving Imperial ships still outnumbered the remaining human vessels by hundreds to 1. Kethvar could still win this war if he could reorganize his forces and press the attack. That was when he received an unexpected message. It was not from the human fleet or Earth's government. It was from the high command of the Zephyrian Empire. Admiral Kethvar, the message said, you are hereby ordered to cease all military operations against the human species. A rebellion has begun in the core worlds. All available forces are needed to defend the Empire. The human war is no longer a priority. Kethver stared at the message in disbelief. The Empire was calling off the war just when victory was still possible, but he understood the reasoning. The human resistance had inspired uprisings throughout Imperial territory. The cost of continuing this war was more than the Empire could afford. Captain Morrison's battered ship approached the Imperial flagship under a flag of truce. The human leader looked older and more tired than when they had first met, but his eyes still held the same determination. "Admiral," Morrison said when they met in the neutral space between their fleets, "I believe we have something to discuss." Kethver looked at the human who had cost the Empire so much. "It seems the war is over, Captain." "Not because either of U.S. won, but because the galaxy has changed." Morrison nodded. "We never wanted this war, Admiral. We just wanted to be free." As they negotiated the terms of the ceasefire, Admiral Kethver realized that the humans had achieved something unprecedented. They had not just defeated the Imperial fleet. They had broken the myth of Imperial invincibility. The galaxy would never be the same. Admiral Kethver sat alone in his damaged command center, recording his final report. The war was over, but the Empire he had served for his entire life was dying. The humans had won something more valuable than victory. They had won their freedom, and shown the galaxy that the Empire could be defeated. 3 months had passed since the ceasefire. The Imperial fleet had withdrawn from human space, taking their surviving ships back to fight rebellions that were spreading across the galaxy. The cost of the human war had been enormous, but the political cost was even greater. The Admiral looked at the tactical reports from the final battle. The numbers still seemed impossible. The humans had turned their own moon into a weapon. They had destroyed the largest fleet in galactic history using nothing but gravity and determination. It was a feat that would be studied by military historians for centuries. Captain Morrison had visited Kethver's ship one final time before the Imperial withdrawal. The human leader looked exhausted but satisfied. His people had paid a terrible price for their freedom, but they had kept their independence. "Admiral," Morrison had said, "I want you to know that we never hated your people. We just could not accept being ruled by anyone else." Kethver had found those words troubling. Throughout the war, he had assumed the humans fought because they were too primitive to understand the benefits of Imperial rule. But Morrison's words suggested something different. The humans had understood exactly what the Empire offered, and they had chosen to reject it. Commander Helen Davis had become something of a legend among Imperial officers. Her raids on supply convoys had been so effective that some Zephyrian commanders refused to travel without heavy escorts. But when Kethver met her during the ceasefire negotiations, he found her to be quiet and thoughtful. "We learned from you," Davis had told him. "Every battle taught us something new about Imperial tactics and technology. We adapted because we had to. You had better weapons, but we had better reasons to fight." That statement had stayed with Admiral Kethver. The Empire had always conquered through superior technology and overwhelming force. They had never faced an enemy that could learn and adapt faster than Imperial doctrine could respond. Captain Paul Wright had shown the most remarkable transformation during the war. His ship, the EDF Endurance, had been rebuilt so many times with captured Imperial technology that it barely resembled its original design. Wright himself had gone from a simple cargo ship captain to a master of space warfare. The Empire taught used to be warriors, Wright had said during one of the prisoner exchanges. Before this war, we were explorers and merchants. You forced us to become something else. Major Chris Lee had survived his suicide mission through pure luck. His ship had been destroyed, but he had been thrown clear in an escape pod just before the collision. When Imperial forces rescued him, they expected to find a fanatic. Instead, they found a man who was sad about the war, but determined to see it through. I did not want to die, Li had told his imperial captors. But I was willing to die if it meant my children could live free. That is the difference between us. These conversations had given Admiral Kethvar a new understanding of human motivation. The Empire had always assumed that conquered species would eventually accept imperial rule because it offered stability and prosperity. But the humans valued something the Empire could not provide: the right to choose their own destiny. The war had changed both species in unexpected ways. The humans had been forced to become more militaristic and ruthless. They had developed weapons and tactics that other species found disturbing. The gentle explorers who had first requested peace talks had become hardened warriors, but the war had also changed the Empire. For the first time in 1,000 years, imperial forces had been defeated by a technologically inferior enemy. The myth of imperial invincibility was broken. Client species throughout the galaxy began to question their loyalty to the Empire. Rebellions that followed the human war were inevitable. The Empire had always maintained control through fear and superior force. When the humans proved that imperial fleets could be defeated, other oppressed species found the courage to fight for their own freedom. Admiral Kethvar had been recalled to the core worlds to help fight these rebellions. But his heart was not in the task. The human war had taught him that the Empire's way of ruling was fundamentally flawed. You could not build a lasting civilization on conquest and oppression. The final imperial withdrawal from human space had been conducted with dignity. Captain Morrison had personally guaranteed the safety of imperial ships during their retreat. There were no attacks on withdrawing forces, no attempts to capture valuable imperial technology. "We got what we wanted," Morrison had explained. "We have our freedom. There is no need for revenge." That generosity had impressed many imperial officers. Even in victory, the humans had shown restraint and honor. It was not the behavior the Empire expected from primitive barbarians. The human colonies had already begun rebuilding. Their losses had been enormous. Millions of people dead, entire fleets destroyed, whole worlds devastated by war. But they were free to rebuild according to their own values and priorities. Commander Davis had been put in charge of developing new defensive technologies. Her research into captured imperial equipment had given humanity access to advanced weapons and shields. But she had made it clear that these technologies would only be used for defense. Captain Wright had returned to his original profession, but with a difference. He now commanded merchant ships that traded with species throughout the galaxy. Human goods and ideas were spreading, carried by traders who had learned to navigate the dangers of interstellar commerce. Major Lee had retired from military service to become a teacher. He wanted to ensure that future generations of humans understood the cost of freedom and the importance of defending it. His students learned about the war not as a glorious victory, but as a terrible necessity. The human government had made an interesting decision about imperial prisoners of war. Instead of keeping them as hostages or slaves, they had offered to repatriate any imperial soldier who wanted to return home. Many chose to stay, finding the human concept of individual freedom appealing. Admiral Kethvar had been one of the imperial officers who chose to stay. He could not return to serve an empire that he no longer believed in. The humans had offered him asylum, and he had accepted. Living among humans had given Kethvar new insights into their character. They were not the savage primitives he had first thought them to be. They were a young species with enormous potential, guided by principles that the Empire had forgotten long ago. The human concept of democracy fascinated him. Instead of being ruled by distant emperors, they chose their own leaders. The government served the people rather than the other way around. It was a system that seemed chaotic to imperial eyes, but it worked. Human science was advancing rapidly. Now that they had access to imperial technology, But they were not simply copying Zephyrian designs. They were improving them, finding new applications, developing innovations that Imperial engineers had never considered. The humans had begun, reaching out to other species, offering trade and friendship instead of conquest. Their approach to diplomacy was completely different from Imperial methods. They treated other species as equals, rather than potential subjects. As Admiral Keth completed his final report, he reflected on the lessons of the war. The Empire had lost because it had failed to understand what it was fighting. They had seen the humans as just another primitive species to be conquered. They had not realized they were facing something entirely new, a species that refused to accept domination. The human victory had not been achieved through superior technology or greater numbers. It had been won through adaptability, creativity, and an unshakable commitment to freedom. These were qualities that could not be defeated by conventional warfare. The Empire's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness. Their reliance on proven tactics and established technology had made them predictable. The humans had exploited this predictability, turning Imperial advantages into disadvantages. Captain Morrison's final message to the galaxy had been simple, but profound. Freedom is not a gift that can be given or taken away. It is a right that must be earned and defended. We fought not because we were strong, but because we were willing to do whatever it took to remain free. That message had resonated throughout the galaxy. Species that had accepted Imperial rule for generations began to question why they had surrendered their independence. A human example showed that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming odds. Admiral Kethfar closed his report with a warning to future generations. The humans called themselves a young species, but they possessed an ancient wisdom. They understood that some things are more important than life itself. They knew that a life without freedom is not worth living. Remember this lesson, for the galaxy will never be the same. The Zephyrian Empire would continue to exist for several more years, but its power was broken. The human war had begun a process that would eventually lead to the Empire's dissolution and the emergence of a new galactic order, based on cooperation rather than conquest. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had defeated an empire not by destroying it,